Marcus Thompson had always been known for his quick temper and even quicker fists. At 28 years old, he stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and calloused hands that told the story of countless bar fights and street altercations. His reputation in the rough neighborhoods of East London preceded him wherever he went. People crossed the street when they saw him coming, not because he was particularly evil, but because trouble seemed to follow him like a shadow. The morning of June 15th started like any other for Marcus. He woke up in his cramped studio apartment above a fish and chip shop, nursing a hangover from the previous night's drinking session at the Crown and Anchor. The smell of grease and fried fish wafted up through the floorboards, mixing with the stale cigarette smoke that permanently lingered in his flat. His reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed bloodshot eyes and a 3-day stubble that made him look older than his years. Marcus had been unemployed for 6 months, ever since he got fired from his job at the construction site for getting into a fight with his supervisor. The man had criticized his work, and Marcus responded the only way he knew how, with his fists. Now he survived on unemployment benefits and the occasional odd job, spending most of his days wandering the streets or drowning his frustrations in cheap beer. On this particular morning, something felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that change was coming. Marcus had received a letter the day before, an eviction notice giving him 2 weeks to come up with 3 months' rent or face homelessness. The stress had been building inside him like pressure in a kettle, and he could feel himself reaching a breaking point. As he walked through the bustling streets of central London, Marcus found himself drawn toward the tourist areas he usually avoided. The contrast between his shabby appearance and the well-dressed visitors made him acutely aware of his situation. Families with expensive cameras snapped photos of historic buildings while he counted the coins in his pocket, wondering if he had enough for lunch. The crowds grew thicker as he approached Westminster, where tour groups gathered around guides holding colorful umbrellas. Marcus pushed through the masses, his frustration growing with each collision and muttered apology. The cheerful chatter of tourists discussing their holiday plans grated on his nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. It was then that he heard the announcement echoing across the square. A ceremonial guard change was about to take place, and hundreds of people were positioning themselves for the best view. Marcus had lived in London his entire life, but had never paid attention to these royal traditions. Today, however, something about the pomp and ceremony struck him as particularly irritating. The king's guards marched into position with their tall black hats and bright red uniforms, their movements precise and synchronized. The crowd pressed forward, phones and cameras raised to capture the spectacle. Marcus found himself squeezed against the barriers, unable to move as more people packed in behind him. A young woman next to him squealed with excitement as the guards performed their routine. "Oh my God, this is so amazing," she gushed to her friend. "I can't believe we're actually seeing the real king's guards." Her enthusiasm felt like salt in Marcus's wounds. Here he was, facing homelessness and desperation, while these people treated his country's traditions like a theme park attraction. The guard closest to Marcus stood perfectly still, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. The man looked to be about Marcus's age, maybe younger, but everything about him radiated discipline and purpose. His uniform was immaculate, his posture flawless, and his dedication to duty absolute. Marcus couldn't help but compare this stranger's life to his own shambles of an existence. As the ceremony continued, Marcus's anger began to simmer. These guards were symbols of everything he felt excluded from: stability, respect, purpose, and a steady income. They represented a system that had left him behind, a society that valued tradition and order, while people like him struggled to survive on the margins. The crowd around him continued to grow, pushing him closer to the barrier. A group of teenagers behind him were making jokes and laughing loudly, their carefree attitude adding to his irritation. An elderly tourist bumped into him while trying to get a better angle for her photograph, not bothering to apologize. Marcus felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, the same feeling that had preceded every fight he'd ever been in. His hands clenched into fists as he stared at the motionless guard. The man's stillness seemed to mock Marcus's inner turmoil. Here was someone who had found his place in the world, who commanded respect simply by standing still, while Marcus couldn't even keep a job or pay his rent. The announcer's voice droned on about the history and significance of the ceremony, but Marcus barely heard the words. His focus had narrowed to the guard standing just a few feet away. In his mind, this stranger had become a symbol of everything wrong with his life, everything that had gone sideways since he left school and started down the path that led him here. A child near the front of the crowd dropped an ice cream cone, and the crying that followed seemed to echo inside Marcus's skull. The mother's attempts to comfort the child mixed with the continued chatter of the crowd, creating a cacophony that felt like it was driving nails into his brain. Marcus knew he should leave. Every rational part of his mind told him to walk away, to go home and figure out how to deal with his problems like an adult. But rationality had never been his strong suit, and the pressure building inside him had reached a critical point. The guard shifted slightly, the first movement Marcus had seen him make. It was barely perceptible, just a minor adjustment of his stance, but to Marcus, it felt like a challenge. His breathing became shallow and rapid as adrenaline began flooding his system. The crowd around him faded into background noise as his vision tunneled toward the red uniform that had become the focus of all his rage and frustration. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Marcus found himself pushing against the barrier. The metal pressed against his ribs as he leaned forward, his eyes locked on the guard's face. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice warned him that he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The moment Marcus decided to act, time seemed to slow down around him. His heart hammered against his ribs as he gripped the metal barrier with both hands, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. The guard remained motionless, unaware that his day was about to take a dramatic turn. The crowd continued their excited chatter, completely oblivious to the storm brewing just feet away from them. Marcus had always been impulsive, but never to this degree. Even in his worst bar fights, there had usually been some provocation, an insult, a shove, someone looking at him wrong. This time was different. The guard had done nothing except stand there and do his job, but in Marcus's twisted state of mind, that was provocation enough. The barrier separating the public from the ceremonial area stood about waist-high, designed more for crowd control than actual security. It wouldn't be difficult to vault over, and Marcus had the athletic ability to do it quickly. Years of manual labor and street fighting had kept him in decent physical shape, despite his poor lifestyle choices. As he prepared to make his move, Marcus caught a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby shop window. His face was flushed red with anger, his eyes wild and unfocused. He looked like a man on the edge of sanity, which wasn't far from the truth. The stress of unemployment, the eviction notice, and years of accumulated disappointments had finally pushed him past his breaking point. A small part of his brain tried one last time to talk him out of what he was about to do. This voice reminded him that attacking a king's guard would have serious consequences, that he was already in enough trouble without adding assault charges to his problems. But that rational voice was quickly drowned out by the roar of rage and frustration that had been building for months. The guard's name was James Mitchell, though Marcus would never learn this. James was 26 years old, had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and took enormous pride in his role protecting the royal family. He had worked hard to earn his position, going through rigorous training and maintaining the highest standards of discipline and professionalism. Standing guard during ceremonies was both an honor and a responsibility he took seriously. James had noticed the agitated man at the barrier but wasn't particularly concerned. In his 3 years of ceremonial duty, he had seen all types of tourists and locals. Some people got excited, others seemed bored, and a few always appeared slightly unhinged. His training had taught him to remain focused on potential genuine threats while ignoring harmless distractions. The crowd around Marcus had grown even denser as more tourists arrived for the ceremony. A group of Japanese visitors squeezed in beside him, their guide explaining the significance of the uniforms in broken English. Behind him, a family from Australia was trying to get their children to stand still for a photo. The pressing bodies and constant noise only added to Marcus's agitation. Without warning, Marcus suddenly vaulted over the barrier. The movement was so quick and unexpected that several seconds passed before anyone fully processed what had happened. Marcus landed heavily on the other side, stumbling slightly as his feet hit the ground. For a brief moment, he stood there facing the guard, both men separated by less than 3 feet of space. James reacted with the training that had been drilled into him thousands of times. His first instinct was to assess the threat level and respond appropriately. The man in front of him was clearly agitated and had just committed a serious breach of security, but he didn't appear to be armed. James's hand moved instinctively toward his radio to call for backup, while he prepared to defend himself if necessary. Marcus saw the guard's movement and interpreted it as aggression. In his current state of mind, everything looked like a threat or a challenge. He took a step forward, bringing himself within arm's reach of James. The crowd behind him had started to realize what was happening, and the excited chatter was beginning to turn into gasps of shock and concern. "You think you're better than me?" Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Standing there in your fancy uniform like you own the place?" His words came out in a rush, months of pent-up frustration pouring out in a stream of barely coherent accusations. James remained calm despite the unexpected confrontation. His training had prepared him for various scenarios, including dealing with disturbed individuals. He kept his voice steady and professional as he spoke. "Sir, you need to step back behind the barrier immediately. This is a restricted area." The calm, authoritative tone only enraged Marcus further. To him it sounded condescending, like the voice of every authority figure who had ever told him what to do, every boss who had criticized his work, every landlord who had threatened eviction. His hands clenched into fists as he took another step closer. The crowd was now fully aware that something serious was happening. People began pulling out their phones to record, while others stepped back to give themselves more space. A few shouted warnings, but their voices were lost in the general commotion. Children who had been excited to see the guards now clung to their parents, sensing the tension in the air. James spoke into his radio quickly, calling for immediate assistance while keeping his eyes fixed on Marcus. He could see that the man was beyond reason, driven by some internal fury that had nothing to do with the ceremony or the guards themselves. This wasn't a terrorist attack or a planned assault. This was someone having a very public breakdown. Marcus heard the radio chatter and saw it as further evidence that the guard thought he was superior. "Calling for help already?" he sneered. "Can't handle one man by yourself?" His voice was getting louder and more aggressive with each word. Spittle flew from his mouth as he gestured wildly with his hands. The other guards in the area had been alerted and were moving into position, but they were bound by strict protocols about when and how they could intervene. They couldn't simply abandon their post without proper authorization, even in an emergency situation. This left James temporarily isolated with an increasingly volatile individual. Marcus could see the other guards beginning to move and realized his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. If he was going to make his point, if he was going to show these symbols of authority that they weren't untouchable, he had to act now. The rational part of his mind made one final attempt to stop him, but it was too late. With a roar of pure rage, Marcus swung his right fist directly at James's face. Years of street fighting had taught him to put his whole body behind a punch, and this one carried all the frustration and anger of his failed life. The blow was aimed at the guard's jaw, intended to knock him down and prove that Marcus Thompson wasn't someone to be ignored or dismissed. James Mitchell's military training kicked in the instant he saw Marcus's fist coming toward his face. Despite the ceremonial nature of his current duty, James was still a soldier who had survived combat in some of the world's most dangerous places. His reflexes, honed by years of training and real-world experience, allowed him to react faster than Marcus had anticipated. The guard ducked slightly and shifted his weight, causing Marcus's punch to glance off the side of his bearskin hat instead of connecting with his jaw. The thick military headgear absorbed most of the impact, though the force was still enough to knock it askew. James immediately straightened and prepared for a counterattack, his professional composure intact despite the assault. Marcus was surprised that his punch hadn't landed as intended, but his rage was too intense for him to think clearly about what had just happened. Instead of reconsidering his actions, he interpreted the failed blow as further humiliation. In his distorted thinking, even his attempt at violence had been ineffective, adding another layer to his sense of inadequacy and failure. The crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Screams erupted from the tourists as they realized they were witnessing an actual attack on a king's guard. People began pushing backward, trying to get away from what they perceived as a dangerous situation. Parents grabbed their children and fled toward the edges of the square, while others stood frozen in shock, their phones still recording every moment. James assessed the situation quickly. His attacker appeared to be alone and didn't seem to have any weapons, but the man was clearly unstable and might attempt another assault. Protocol dictated that he should defend himself while minimizing harm to both the attacker and innocent bystanders. However, James also knew that anything he did would be captured on dozens of cameras and would likely end up on social media within minutes. Marcus, seeing that the guard remained standing and composed, felt his humiliation deepen. "Fight me like a man!" he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. "Stop hiding behind that stupid hat!" His face was now completely red, and the veins in his neck bulged as his blood pressure spiked from the adrenaline and rage coursing through his system. Before James could respond, Marcus threw another punch, this time aiming for the guard's chest. His form was sloppy due to his emotional state, and the blow lacked the power and precision of his previous attempt. James easily sidestepped the attack and grabbed Marcus's extended arm, using the man's own momentum against him. With a practiced movement that looked almost effortless, James spun Marcus around and applied an arm lock that immediately neutralized the threat. Marcus found himself face down on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that would cause excruciating pain if he tried to resist. The entire sequence took less than 5 seconds and demonstrated the vast difference between a trained soldier and an angry street brawler. "Let me go," Marcus shouted, his voice muffled by his position on the ground. "This is police brutality." His accusations made no sense since James wasn't a police officer, but rational thinking had completely abandoned Marcus by this point. He struggled against the arm lock, only succeeding in causing himself more pain. James maintained his professional demeanor even as he held Marcus on the ground. "Sir, you are under detention for assault," he said in a calm, clear voice that carried easily to the crowd. "Backup is on the way. If you stop resisting, you will not be harmed." The other guards had now moved into position around the scene, creating a protective perimeter while waiting for the police to arrive. Their movements were coordinated and efficient, a result of extensive training in crowd control and emergency response. Despite the chaos around them, they maintained the dignity and professionalism expected of their position. Marcus could hear the approaching sirens of police vehicles and realized that his situation was about to become much worse. In his current position, he couldn't see the crowd, but he could hear their excited chatter and the constant clicking of camera shutters. The thought that his humiliation was being documented by hundreds of strangers only intensified his rage. "You think you've won?" Marcus spat, turning his head to try to look at James. "You're nothing but a toy soldier playing dress-up. When I get out of this, I'll find you." His threats were empty, born of frustration and impotence, but they were serious enough to be recorded as evidence of his state of mind. James didn't respond to the threats. His training had taught him that engaging with agitated individuals often escalated situations rather than calming them. Instead, he maintained his hold on Marcus while scanning the crowd for any signs of additional threats. The possibility that this attack was a distraction for something larger couldn't be completely ruled out. The first police officers arrived on scene within 3 minutes of James's initial radio call. They pushed through the crowd with practiced efficiency, taking control of the situation from the guards. Marcus was officially arrested and read his rights while still lying on the ground, his face pressed against the cold stone of the ceremonial area. As the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, Marcus finally began to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. The adrenaline was starting to wear off and reality was creeping back in. He had just attacked a member of the King's Guard in front of hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras. This wasn't going to be like his previous bar fights where charges might be dropped or plea bargained away. The police officers hauled Marcus to his feet, and for the first time, he could see the crowd that had witnessed his breakdown. Hundreds of faces stared back at him, some showing shock, others disgust, and many simply curious about the spectacle they had witnessed. Children pointed at him while their parents pulled them away, treating him like a dangerous animal. James straightened his uniform and adjusted his hat, quickly returning to his ceremonial position as if nothing had happened. His professionalism in the face of the attack only served to highlight Marcus's loss of control. Where the guard had remained calm and effective throughout the encounter, Marcus had descended into chaos and accomplished nothing except his own arrest. As the police led Marcus away toward their vehicle, he caught one last glimpse of James standing at attention. The guard's face showed no emotion, no satisfaction at having defeated his attacker, no anger at being assaulted. There was only the same disciplined composure he had maintained throughout his duties. This final image burned itself into Marcus's memory. Even in victory, the guard maintained his dignity and professionalism, qualities that Marcus had never possessed and now realized he never would. The contrast between their behaviors during the confrontation would haunt him long after the physical consequences of his actions had been resolved. The police van's doors slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo in Marcus's bones. As the vehicle pulled away from the scene, he could see through the small window that the ceremonial proceedings had already resumed. The guards had returned to their positions as if his outburst had been nothing more than a minor interruption in their day. The tourists were taking photos again, though many were now pointing and talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. During the short ride to the police station, Marcus sat in stunned silence. The handcuffs cut into his wrists and his shoulder ached from where James had applied the arm lock, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the crushing realization of what he had done. In less than 10 minutes, he had transformed from an unknown, unemployed man into someone who would be featured on news, broadcasts around the world. The custody sergeant at the police station was a weathered woman in her 50s who had seen every type of criminal London had to offer. She processed Marcus with efficient indifference, taking his fingerprints and photograph while reciting the standard warnings about his rights. Her calm professionalism reminded him uncomfortably of James's demeanor during their confrontation. "Assault on a king's guard," she read from the charge sheet without looking up. "That's a first for me this week. Usually takes until Friday to see something this stupid." Her comment wasn't meant to be cruel, just a statement of fact from someone who had processed thousands of poor decisions over her career. Marcus was placed in a holding cell with 2 other men who had been arrested earlier that day. One was sleeping off a drinking binge, while the other paced nervously while muttering about conspiracy theories. The cell smelled of disinfectant and despair, a combination that perfectly matched Marcus's current emotional state. As he sat on the narrow bench, Marcus tried to understand what had driven him to attack the guard. Even in his worst moments, he had never done anything quite so public or destructive. Bar fights were one thing. They happened in dark corners between people who often deserved each other. But assaulting someone who was simply doing their job, someone who had never wronged him in any way, felt different. The reality of his situation began to sink in as the hours passed. He would likely face serious criminal charges that could result in significant jail time. His unemployment benefits would be cut off, and he would be evicted from his apartment long before any trial concluded. The attack had been captured on countless cameras and would follow him for the rest of his life, making employment even more difficult to find. Meanwhile, news of the incident was already spreading across social media. Someone in the crowd had live-streamed the entire confrontation, and the video was being shared thousands of times per hour. News outlets were picking up the story, describing it as an unprovoked attack on British heritage and a shocking display of anti-royal sentiment. The footage showed Marcus's face clearly during his arrest, and within hours someone had identified him by name. His few social media profiles were flooded with angry messages from people calling him everything, from a terrorist to a disgrace to humanity. The internet's capacity for instant judgment and collective outrage was being directed at him with full force. Detective Inspector Sarah Clark arrived at the station that evening to interview Marcus. She was a seasoned investigator who specialized in cases involving attacks on public officials and had seen how quickly these situations could spiral out of control. Her approach was professional but firm, designed to get the truth while protecting everyone involved. "Mr. Thompson," she began as she sat across from him in the interview room, "I need to understand what happened today. The footage shows you attacking Guard Mitchell without any apparent provocation. Can you explain your actions?" Marcus looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. The adrenaline crash had left him feeling hollow and exhausted. "I don't know," he said quietly. I lost it. Everything's been going wrong, and I saw him standing there so perfect and calm, and I just couldn't handle it anymore." Detective Clark had heard similar explanations before. People often lashed out at symbols of authority or stability, when their own lives fell apart. It didn't excuse the behavior, but it helped explain the psychology behind seemingly random attacks. "Were you under the influence of drugs or alcohol today?" she asked, though the medical examination at the station had already confirmed he was sober during the incident. "No, I wish I was," Marcus replied. "At least then I'd have an excuse." His honesty was refreshing compared to the elaborate justifications she usually heard from suspects. The interview continued for another hour, covering Marcus's background, his recent troubles, and his mental state leading up to the attack. Detective Clark built a picture of a man who had been struggling for months and had finally reached a breaking point. It was a tragic story, but one that didn't change the fact that a serious crime had been committed. Back at his apartment, Marcus's landlord had already heard about the incident on the news. Recognizing his tenant's face on the television, Mr. Peterson immediately began the process of having Marcus removed from the property. The last thing he needed was media attention and protesters gathering outside his building. The apartment that Marcus had been fighting to keep was being emptied of his possessions, even as he sat in custody. His few valuable items were being held for evidence, while the rest was piled into garbage bags and left on the curb. The life he had been desperately trying to preserve was disappearing while he faced the consequences of his actions. James Mitchell, meanwhile, had finished his shift and returned to the barracks where his fellow guards were eager to hear his account of the incident. Unlike the sensationalized versions appearing in the media, James's description was factual and unemotional. He had been attacked, he had neutralized the threat, and the police had handled the rest. To him, it was simply part of the job. The military was conducting its own investigation into the incident, reviewing security protocols and assessing whether any changes needed to be made to protect ceremonial guards in the future. James would likely receive a commendation for his professional handling of the situation, though he didn't seek recognition for simply doing his duty. As the news cycle continued to churn, Marcus's story was being told and retold by people who had never met him. Some portrayed him as a victim of societal inequality, while others saw him as a dangerous criminal who deserved harsh punishment. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative suggested. In his cell, Marcus stared at the ceiling and wondered how his life had come to this point. 24 hours earlier, his biggest worry had been paying rent.
Now he was facing the possibility of years in prison and a lifetime of notoriety for the worst decision he had ever made.
The guard he had attacked would go home to his family and continue his respected career, while Marcus's future had been destroyed in a moment of uncontrolled rage. The police van's doors slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo in Marcus's bones. As the vehicle pulled away from the scene, he could see through the small window that the ceremonial proceedings had already resumed. The guards had returned to their positions as if his outburst had been nothing more than a minor interruption in their day. The tourists were taking photos again, though many were now pointing and talking excitedly about what they had just witnessed. During the short ride to the police station, Marcus sat in stunned silence. The handcuffs cut into his wrists, and his shoulder ached from where James had applied the arm lock. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the crushing realization of what he had done. In less than 10 minutes, he had transformed from an unknown unemployed man into someone who would be featured on news broadcasts around the world. The custody sergeant at the police station was a weathered woman in her 50s who had seen every type of criminal London had to offer. She processed Marcus with efficient indifference, taking his fingerprints and photograph while reciting the standard warnings about his rights. Her calm professionalism reminded him uncomfortably of James's demeanor during their confrontation. "Assault on a King's Guard," she read from the charge sheet without looking up. "That's a first for me this week. Usually takes until Friday to see something this stupid." Her comment wasn't meant to be cruel, just a statement of fact from someone who had processed thousands of poor decisions over her career. Marcus was placed in a holding cell with 2 other men who had been arrested earlier that day. One was sleeping off a drinking binge, while the other paced nervously while muttering about conspiracy theories. The cell smelled of disinfectant and despair, a combination that perfectly matched Marcus's current emotional state. As he sat on the narrow bench, Marcus tried to understand what had driven him to attack the guard. Even in his worst moments, he had never done anything quite so public or destructive. Bar fights were one thing. They happened in dark corners between people who often deserved each other. But assaulting someone who was simply doing their job, someone who had never wronged him in any way, felt different. The reality of his situation began to sink in as the hours passed. He would likely face serious criminal charges that could result in significant jail time. His unemployment benefits would be cut off and he would be evicted from his apartment long before any trial concluded. The attack had been captured on countless cameras and would follow him for the rest of his life, making employment even more difficult to find. Meanwhile, news of the incident was already spreading across social media. Someone in the crowd had live-streamed the entire confrontation, and the video was being shared thousands of times per hour. News outlets were picking up the story, describing it as an unprovoked attack on British heritage and a shocking display of anti-royal sentiment. The footage showed Marcus's face clearly during his arrest, and within hours someone had identified him by name. His few social media profiles were flooded with angry messages from people calling him everything from a terrorist to a disgrace to humanity. The internet's capacity for instant judgment and collective outrage was being directed at him with full force. Detective Inspector Sarah Clark arrived at the station that evening to interview Marcus. She was a seasoned investigator who specialized in cases involving attacks on public officials and had seen how quickly these situations could spiral out of control. Her approach was professional but firm, designed to get the truth while protecting everyone involved. "Mr. Thompson," she began as she sat across from him in the interview room, "I need to understand what happened today. The footage shows you attacking Guard Mitchell without any apparent provocation. Can you explain your actions?" Marcus looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. The adrenaline crash had left him feeling hollow and exhausted. "I don't know," he said quietly. I lost it. Everything's been going wrong and I saw him standing there so perfect and calm, and I just couldn't handle it anymore." Detective Clark had heard similar explanations before. People often lashed out at symbols of authority or stability when their own lives fell apart. It didn't excuse the behavior, but it helped explain the psychology behind seemingly random attacks. "Were you under the influence of drugs or alcohol today?" she asked, though the medical examination at the station had already confirmed he was sober during the incident. "No, I wish I was," Marcus replied. "At least then I'd have an excuse." His honesty was refreshing compared to the elaborate justifications she usually heard from suspects. The interview continued for another hour, covering Marcus's background, his recent troubles, and his mental state leading up to the attack. Detective Clark built a picture of a man who had been struggling for months and had finally reached a breaking point. It was a tragic story, but one that didn't change the fact that a serious crime had been committed. Back at his apartment, Marcus's landlord had already heard about the incident on the news. Recognizing his tenant's face on the television, Mr. Peterson immediately began the process of having Marcus removed from the property. The last thing he needed was media attention and protesters gathering outside his building. The apartment that Marcus had been fighting to keep was being emptied of his possessions even as he sat in custody. His few valuable items were being held for evidence, while the rest was piled into garbage bags and left on the curb. The life he had been desperately trying to preserve was disappearing, while he faced the consequences of his actions. James Mitchell, meanwhile, had finished his shift and returned to the barracks where his fellow guards were eager to hear his account of the incident. Unlike the sensationalized versions appearing in the media, James's description was factual and unemotional. He had been attacked, he had neutralized the threat, and the police had handled the rest. To him, it was simply part of the job. The military was conducting its own investigation into the incident, reviewing security protocols and assessing whether any changes needed to be made to protect ceremonial guards in the future. James would likely receive a commendation for his professional handling of the situation, though he didn't seek recognition for simply doing his duty. As the news cycle continued to churn, Marcus's story was being told and retold by people who had never met him. Some portrayed him as a victim of societal inequality, while others saw him as a dangerous criminal who deserved harsh punishment. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative suggested. In his cell, Marcus stared at the ceiling and wondered how his life had come to this point. 24 hours earlier, his biggest worry had been paying rent. Now he was facing the possibility of years in prison and a lifetime of notoriety for the worst decision he had ever made. The guard he had attacked would go home to his family and continue his respected career, while Marcus's future had been destroyed in a moment of uncontrolled rage. The day of Marcus's trial arrived with unprecedented media attention. News vans lined the street outside the Old Bailey, and protesters had gathered on both sides of the case. Some held signs calling for harsh punishment, while others advocated for understanding and mental health support. The courthouse had to implement special security measures to handle the crowds and ensure the proceedings could continue without disruption. Judge Robert Fairfax, a veteran of high-profile cases, presided over the trial with firm control. He had seen the media circus surrounding the case and was determined to focus on the facts rather than the public spectacle. Marcus entered the dock looking gaunt and nervous, his months in custody having taken a visible toll on his physical and mental state. The prosecution, led by Queen's Counsel Margaret Sterling, presented their case with clinical precision. They had an overwhelming amount of evidence, including the viral video that had been viewed millions of times worldwide. The footage showed Marcus's unprovoked attack from multiple angles, leaving no room for doubt about what had occurred. Members of the jury, Sterling began her opening statement. You will see clear evidence that the defendant deliberately chose to assault Guard Mitchell while he was performing his ceremonial duties. This was not a moment of temporary insanity, but a calculated decision to commit violence against a representative of our constitutional monarchy. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They called witness after witness, each confirming the basic facts of the attack. Tourist Maria Santos described seeing Marcus climb over the barrier like a wild animal. Retired teacher Jeffrey Walsh testified about the fear that spread through the crowd when the attack began. Each testimony painted Marcus as an aggressor who had terrorized innocent bystanders. When James Mitchell took the stand again, the courtroom fell silent. He appeared in his dress uniform, every detail perfect despite the months that had passed since the incident. His testimony was the same professional account he had given during the preliminary hearing, but its impact in the formal trial setting was even more powerful. Under cross-examination, David Brennan tried to suggest that James could have de-escalated the situation differently, but the guard's responses were calm and reasoned. I followed my training and used the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat, James explained. My primary concern was protecting the public and myself from further harm. The defense's case rested heavily on Marcus's mental state and the circumstances that had led to his breakdown. Dr. Morrison testified about his psychological evaluation, describing a man who had been struggling with depression, anxiety, and feelings of worthlessness for months before the attack. Mr. Thompson was experiencing what we call a psychological crisis. Dr. Morrison explained to the jury. The combination of unemployment, financial stress, and social isolation had created a perfect storm of mental health issues. While this doesn't excuse his actions, it helps explain the psychological state that led to such uncharacteristic behavior. Emma Thompson took the stand as a character witness for her brother, her voice shaking as she described the man she had known before his life fell apart. Marcus wasn't always like this, she told the jury. He used to be kind and funny. He helped me through nursing school, and he was there for our parents when they were dying. The man who attacked that guard isn't the brother I grew up with. Marcus himself chose to testify against his lawyer's advice. His appearance in the witness box was painful to watch. The confident, aggressive man from the viral video had been replaced by someone who seemed broken and defeated. His voice was barely above a whisper as he described the months leading up to the attack. I know what I did was wrong, he told the court, his hands shaking as he gripped the witness stand. I've had months to think about it, and I can't believe I attacked someone who was just doing his job. Guard Mitchell didn't deserve what I did to him. Nobody deserves that. Under cross-examination, Sterling pressed Marcus about his history of violence and his decision to target a King's Guard specifically. You've been in numerous fights over the years, haven't you, Mr. Thompson? This wasn't your first resort to violence when things didn't go your way. Marcus admitted to his past fights, but insisted this incident was different. Those were bar fights, arguments that got out of hand. I don't know what this was. I was angry at everything, and he was just there. It wasn't fair to him. The prosecutor pushed harder. So you're saying you attacked Guard Mitchell simply because he represented everything you felt you lacked in your own life? Because he had stability and respect while you had neither? The question hit home and Marcus struggled to answer. Maybe, he said finally. I was jealous, I guess. He had his life together and mine was falling apart, but that's not his fault, and I had no right to take it out on him. The jury deliberated for 2 days, reflecting the complexity of the case despite the clear evidence of guilt. They had to weigh the undeniable fact of the assault against the testimony about Marcus's mental state and the circumstances that had led to his breakdown. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Fairfax called for silence as the jury foreman stood to deliver their decision. Marcus stood as well, his legs barely supporting him as he awaited the judgment that would determine the rest of his life. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty, the foreman announced. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Though he had known this outcome was inevitable, the evidence against him had been overwhelming, and his own testimony had confirmed his guilt. The conviction made headlines around the world, with many outlets focusing on the symbolic nature of the crime. Editorial writers debated what the case said about modern society, social inequality, and the state of mental health care. Marcus had become more than just a defendant. He had become a symbol for various social and political causes. Judge Fairfax scheduled sentencing for the following week, allowing time for pre-sentence reports and victim impact statements. Marcus was returned to custody to await his fate, knowing that his conviction had sealed his transformation from an unknown unemployed man into a cautionary tale about anger, desperation, and the consequences of losing control. The sentencing hearing arrived on a gray London morning that matched Marcus's mood perfectly. He had spent the week since his conviction in a state of numb acceptance, finally understanding that his old life was truly over. The pre-sentence reports painted a picture of a man who had lost everything and posed little threat of reoffending. But they couldn't undo the serious nature of his crime. Judge Fairfax entered the courtroom with the weight of public expectation on his shoulders. The case had generated intense debate about appropriate punishment, with some calling for the maximum sentence to send a message about respecting national institutions, while others argued for leniency based on Marcus's mental health struggles and genuine remorse. James Mitchell had submitted a victim impact statement that was read aloud by the prosecution. His words were measured and professional, focusing on the impact the attack had on his ability to perform his duties and the stress it had placed on his family. He didn't call for revenge or excessive punishment, but simply stated the facts of how the incident had affected his life. The attack was unprovoked and frightening. The statement read, "While I was physically unharmed due to my training, the incident has required increased security measures and has caused concern for my family's safety. I hope Mr. Thompson receives the help he needs to address whatever issues led to this behavior." Marcus felt a fresh wave of shame as he heard these words. Even in describing the attack against him, James Mitchell maintained the same dignity and professionalism he had shown throughout the ordeal. The contrast between their characters had never been more stark or painful. David Brennan made one final plea for leniency during his sentencing submission. He argued that Marcus had already suffered significant consequences through his conviction, loss of employment prospects, and social isolation. The lawyer painted a picture of a man who had reached rock bottom and was genuinely remorseful for his actions. "Your Honor," Brennan argued, "my client stands before you as a broken man who has lost everything. He doesn't seek to minimize his crime or escape responsibility. He simply asks for the opportunity to rebuild his life and contribute positively to society. A lengthy prison sentence would serve no purpose other than revenge." The prosecution, however, maintained that the serious nature of the offense required a substantial custodial sentence. Sterling argued that attacking a King's Guard wasn't just assault on an individual, but an attack on the institutions and traditions that defined British society. The defendant chose to assault a representative of our constitutional monarchy, while that person was performing ceremonial duties. Sterling told the judge, "This wasn't a bar fight or a domestic dispute. It was a deliberate attack on someone whose only crime was serving his country with honor and distinction." Judge Fairfax listened carefully to all arguments before beginning his sentencing remarks. The courtroom fell silent as he reviewed the facts of the case and the various factors he had to consider. Marcus stood with his hands clasped behind his back, trying to maintain some dignity in what might be his final public appearance. "Mr. Thompson," the judge began, "you have pleaded guilty to assault against Guard Mitchell while he was performing his ceremonial duties. This was an unprovoked attack on someone who posed no threat to you and who was simply doing his job with the professionalism expected of his position. Marcus nodded, accepting the judge's characterization of his crime. There was no point in trying to minimize what he had done or make excuses for behavior that was inexcusable, regardless of his circumstances. However, Judge Fairfax continued, I must also consider the factors that led to this incident. The evidence shows that you were struggling with significant mental health issues and had reached a crisis point in your life. Your genuine remorse and the low likelihood of reoffending are also relevant factors. The judge's words gave Marcus a small glimmer of hope that his sentence might be more lenient than the maximum allowed. He had prepared himself for several years in prison, but even a few months less would be meaningful to him. Taking all factors into consideration, Judge Fairfax announced, I sentence you to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 months, contingent on your participation in mental health counseling and anger management programs. The sentence was met with mixed reactions from the public gallery. Some felt it was too lenient for such a serious offense, while others thought it was appropriate given Marcus's circumstances and remorse. The media coverage would be similarly divided, with different outlets interpreting the sentence according to their editorial perspectives. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and resignation as he was led from the dock. 18 months was less than he had feared, but still represented a significant portion of his life. More importantly, it confirmed that his conviction would follow him forever, making it nearly impossible to find employment or housing when he was eventually released. As he was processed back into the prison system, Marcus reflected on the chain of events that had brought him to this point. His attack on James Mitchell had taken less than a minute, but its consequences would last for the rest of his life. He had traded a moment of rage for years of punishment and a lifetime of notoriety. The viral video of his attack continued to circulate on social media, serving as a permanent reminder of his worst moment. Potential employers would see it, landlords would recognize his face, and strangers would judge him based on those few seconds of footage. He had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of losing control and the price of violence. James Mitchell, meanwhile, had returned to his duties with the same quiet professionalism he had always shown. The attack had become just another challenge he had faced and overcome in his military career. He received commendations for his handling of the incident, but didn't seek recognition for simply doing his job properly. 6 months into his sentence, Marcus received an unexpected letter. It was from James Mitchell, written on plain paper without any official letterhead. The guard had tracked down Marcus's prison address through official channels and had decided to reach out directly. Mr. Thompson, the letter began, I wanted you to know that I harbor no personal animosity toward you for what happened. I understand that you were struggling with difficulties that led to a moment of poor judgment. I hope you're using your time in custody to address whatever issues contributed to that day, and I wish you success in rebuilding your life when you're released. The letter was signed simply J. Mitchell, without any mention of his rank or position. Marcus read it several times, amazed by the grace and forgiveness shown by the man he had attacked. The letter represented everything Marcus wished he could be: dignified, professional, and capable of responding to adversity with character rather than violence. As his release date approached, Marcus began the difficult process of planning for a future that would be forever shaped by his conviction. He had completed anger management and mental health programs in prison, gaining insights into the psychological factors that had led to his breakdown. But he knew that understanding his problems and overcoming their consequences were two very different challenges. The world Marcus would return to had moved on without him. The viral video of his attack had been replaced by newer controversies and scandals, but it remained permanently archived on the internet, ready to surface whenever anyone searched his name. He would have to find a way to build a new life while carrying the weight of his worst moment forever.